right, Steffen, thanks for coming on. So we've worked together formally for over 3 years, but I think one of the downsides of working remotely is that I actually don't really know that much about your background, as much as we have worked together. So why don't we go and start at the beginning? So you're from and remain in Germany, and where did you grow up exactly?
So it's in North Rhine-Westphalia at the River Rhine. Maybe some Americans know that geographical feature. I currently live in Oberhausen, which is a somewhat larger town in the rural area. And so most of the time I spend in the area, actually, not that far away from here.
And so, like growing up, what were some of your interests? I mean, I assume that it wasn't energy and philosophy.
Not exactly, no. I just early on I was hooked up with computers in general. So early on in the 90s, I got my first computer. Christmas, I think it was 91 or so. It was a Commodore Amiga 500. For anyone who still knows, that was a good computer for the time. So I was very interested in technology, video games in particular, as a kid, and so I was really going into that field, kind of. So I started to study computer sciences and economics. But I really had a wandering mind. I was interested in everything, but didn't really accomplish or finish anything in any realm. So so on my resume, I would say I'm an unskilled hand. I'm just I just don't have any training. I'm just doing everything, and I'm a generalist in some sense. But that's sort of my upcoming until CIP. Into the Center for Industrial Progress.
How did you become interested in ideas?
Well, for my entire life, I was someone who liked to argue a lot. And so you need a lot of knowledge to win arguments, obviously. And I really had a bad habit of arguing about everything and being interested in everything to just know better. That was sort of
I can relate to that
early on. And so what really changed my mindset was 9/11. So
how old were you when that happened?
So I was 20. I think it was, so 2001, that was 20, yeah. So I came home from university and I watched that on TV. And so that's somewhat changed my perspective on the world. I was thinking, like, how is it possible? Like, why does it happen? Like, how to make sense of this? I always try to make logical sense of things. And if you don't understand that ideas drive history, you cannot understand, like, why would someone make a mistake like that, or make something senseless like that? And so that made me interested in a broader perspective. And I started to consume a lot of particularly English-speaking media, American media. And I gained a perspective that I didn't really had growing up in Germany, speaking with Germans and reading German newspapers. And
how did you learn English?
It was a high school major of mine. So I learned British English, the wrong kind of English, as some people like to say. That's how I formally learned English. And then I consumed a lot of media, and then I really learned English, or to understand English really well enough to get into details of any kind of field. And so that shocked me to some degree, and I learned that I need to understand how the world functions, how it operates, and
what were some, I think it's interesting that you were asking those kinds of questions. I think a lot of people are asking those kinds of questions, but then often they'd settle for very superficial answers, like
Yes.
either they're crazy or even something that I'm more sympathetic with, but I think can be taken very superficially, which is, oh, religion motivated them, which I think has a lot that's right about it, but it still doesn't give you a full picture of human psychology of, okay, how could people take a religion this seriously, and why would they think it compels them to take this sort of action? Were there any particular ideas you encountered that you thought, yeah, this is actually bringing me clarity about this?
None of that was satisfying, sadly. So the mainstream, even in America, where you have a broader kind of perspective on things, you have a real left-right distinction in the political area, which you don't really have in Germany. You have a left and even more left by the American scale. But it nothing, like a lot of people explain things like hey, what is the scholarship in like this Islamic sect telling you to do, and so on. So a lot of technical knowledge that doesn't really explain things. So you had a lot of factoids that went into this, but still it didn't explain anything before that, and what happened on 9/11, and it didn't explain anything that went on after that. So it wasn't really satisfying. And initially, I wasn't really confronted with the works of Ayn Rand, but I started to consume a lot of alternative media in the American realm. And then I started to learn from scholars of objectivism and Ayn Rand, taking their perspective. And that made a lot of sense to me. So that's the first time I started to think, yeah, there's really something there that can explain how the world operates, why people are motivated to do certain things they do, that you, from your own perspective, cannot understand possibly. Like if you're not a religious person, you obviously cannot understand how a religious person thinks or acts, or is so ingrained in that. But yeah, so that's essentially how I came to a more philosophical view on the world, by just looking at which people made the most sense and really looking for that. And for years I wandered through all kinds of media outlets and didn't get a good perspective. So I intuitively I knew there was something off with all of the explanations that went on.
Yeah, for me, I mean, because I had discovered Ayn Rand in, I think, 96. So like, but there was a big lesson to me, but it was from the other direction, which is that what really drove home that, yeah, ideas do shape action was not so much the Islamists, but the America's reaction to it. Like, here's a country that, like, you could take seriously militarily, could crush any other nation just on a purely physical level, and was choosing not to, and was clearly choosing not to because of ideas. And it was ideas holding them back. And with, like, once I saw that, I think it really ingrained, even though I agreed with it intellectually, but now I could see down to the roots that, oh, it's really true that people are moved by morality, that we're not defeating the enemy, and that we're engaging in these kind of wars of self-sacrifice because of the ideas that we believed in. Do you remember how you actually first encountered objectivist thinkers?
I don't remember that exactly. It was some TV interview, I guess, and it's probably alternative media. Someone was interviewed on some fringe channel that I watched over the internet.
I mean, those stories actually always make me feel better, because you kind of tell yourself, when you do kind of interviews that are not like, Fox News or C-SPAN, that, hey, maybe this will, somebody will see this. Usually what I tell myself is this is good practice, but that, you never actually know who you're influencing in those kinds of cases.
Yeah.
And so, all right, so you're in university at this point. What are you studying?
Economics and business administration. So it was some combination of that.
And how did you get interested in economics?
I just thought this is a really useful thing to know, right? So it explains a lot of the world. It gives you some head start in the business world. If you want a good job, it's just a useful skill and a useful thing to analyze. So the economics part was actually more interesting to me than the business administration part.
Yeah, well, my major was business administration, and I almost got a minor in economics. I think it was like one or two. In fact, maybe I did qualify for one, but that was way more interesting. Even when I disagreed with them, which was very often, but it was just much more fascinating because part of what I realized, because I was also working at the time, was, oh, almost nothing I'm learning in school about business applies to actual business. Whereas economics actually was helping me understand the world and posing interesting questions and had a method to it. And even when I thought the method wasn't right, there was something really, I'm always interested in anything that has kind of a method to it. I think that's why I was interested in philosophy. And I think it's one of the reasons, as I'm sure we'll get to, that I really was excited by what Alex was doing in energy, where he was making method explicit and interesting to people from all walks of life, rather than just something like me and my friends interested in philosophy were fascinated by. So before we get to that, though, I'm curious about, you made the offhand comment about Germany being left and further left, and I'm curious as to if you could say a little bit more about sort of what is the kind of intellectual culture there that you grew up in, and to what extent you think it influenced you, or you spotted problems with it early on. That what was that like?
So I was very, very skeptical of everything as a teenager. So the teachers didn't really ruin me. I did everything to myself, if anything. But I remember there was some kind of, like, I grew up as I was baptized as a Protestant. It was not a religious household, but I was sort of ingrained in that and didn't think about it. So I went to some kind of Bible school, and I think it was at the age of 12, 13, something like that. So I remember that's the earliest thing I remember where really something is off with the culture. And we had the task of writing a letter. I think it was from Enrico Fermi, which was some of the leading scientists in the Manhattan Project, and apologized to God for creating this nuclear bomb. And I was thinking, like, what the hell is wrong with these people? Like, the good guys get the weapon to end the war of all wars, and they should apologize for that, for the use of that weapon. So that's the first thing I remember where something is really off. And so this is, you could ascribe that to this particular priest or this particular section of the church, which is very organized in Germany, the Protestant church. But there's something off in school. Actually, I remember one more thing that's much earlier than that, and that is elementary school. So some teacher, there were these little squares on the floor, and he tried to explain wars going on in the world. I think it was like the Gulf War in 91, 92, something like that. The Iraq War, one of the Iraq wars. And so this was big headlines in the newspapers. And so he tried to explain war. So every pupil, every student had to go on one of these tiles. And then when there were no more tiles, he would just toss in one more person and then tell everyone, hey, defend your territory, right? That's your territory. You can't just let people in. You have to push them around. And so they can go nowhere. So there's a conflict, right? That's how they explained war to us in elementary school. I remember that. I don't remember much from that time, but I remember that. There's something off with that. This is even as a kid, I realized that this is not satisfying. There's not a satisfying explanation of people killing each other,
right?
Or organized warfare and stuff like that. So this is what you grow up with in the public school curricula.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reflects sort of, I mean, what it really seems to reflect is, what you could think of like the age of empires way of thinking about wars, like pre-World War I, right? It's that, well, we just take it for granted that everybody's after, maximizing land and control of the land. And if they have it, you have to shove them off. And there's these inherent conflicts, but it's not viewed through a moral prism. Whereas like in the US growing up, war, even when it wasn't seen in moral terms, or even when you shouldn't really think about it primarily in moral terms, like good versus evil, it would have been treated more that way. It's, well, there's the good guys and there's the bad guys, and you always want to be with the good guys. I mean, that's one thing that I've been thinking a lot about. I think one of the things that's happening in the US and has for a long time, but it's really starting, I think, to succeed, is a concerted attempt to make us ashamed of the country and its history, and in part by pointing to real things that are shameful, right? Like slavery. I mean, maybe you have some insight, because I mean, in Germany's more recent past, right, there's things that like were
in the distant past as well. But
what's that?
In the distant past as well. So, but that's like the unification into one big country really happened in 1870. So it's not that long a history. But yeah, of course, I mean, the Nazi regime is, of course, a topic that every student learns about early on.
But my question would be, like, how do you think that affects, like, I think it's important to be honest about a country's past, but at the same time, I think it's very dangerous if you feel ashamed of your own past, or it's at least, it's hard for me to project what, I know why it's happening in America, because if they can be shamed for their past, and the people who want power and control and who hate America's goodness, the fact that it stood for freedom, then they have the ability to override that. How do you see that play out in a country like in Germany, where there's that sort of past to contend with?
I think the problem is not that, like, the territory you were born on happened to inhabit, a regime of epic evil. I don't think that's how it is. I think it's the way this is reflected on. This is so like the 13 colonies are not the same country like that America is today, in a sense. And the Nazi Germany is not the same country as the Federal Republic of Germany after like 1950. And I think that the issue is that what the German culture as a whole learned from World War II is very different from what it should have learned. So, I mean, if I may use this sort of phrase, so people didn't learn it's like Nazis are evil. People learned like, oh, the war of the Nazis was evil, but being a collectivist fascist in a different clothing is perfectly okay. So they didn't really go into the philosophical depth of analyzing what is this, what is the evil part of this, and then what are the consequences of this. They said, oh, the consequences were really horrible. Like, a lot of people died, a lot of people were murdered in concentration camps, and a lot of victims of war, and but this is, then they reflect, okay, so there are a couple of superficial things that we can learn. War is bad. That's what the generation of my grandparents learned. Never again war. Like, it's not never again being a collectivist fascist or something like that. No, right. Never again war. We just don't fight. Not for good, not for evil, right? And so the military is really not treated well in Germany. It's super underfunded, and this is not because there's no threat like to the east in Europe, but it's because this is not something we want to ever use, even if we have to fight evil. We don't want to be armed, so weapons are bad, sort of thinking. And then
go ahead.
And then I think culturally, a lot of the bad things that happened or that led to Nazi Germany were never really identified and fought. So we are constantly fighting the Nazis, like as if this was some strange entity that has no culture, but they just pop up in the 1920s, then they win a power struggle, take over the country, or so there's a phrase in Germany like Adolf Hitler is a seducer. Right? He was seducing people. He was just had this shady methods of seducing people into his ideology or something like that. And so this is a very superficial reflection on what happened, starting before even World War One. And so if you don't learn anything from your mistakes, then part of the mistake, at least, you're poised to repeat. And you can really identify. You can identify the obvious evils, but you cannot identify the roots of the evils. And so, yeah, there's a big danger of returning to this collectivist thing. And this is reflected in the fact that the Eastern German communists, they were just absorbed. They were also like very brutish collectivist regime, but it's sort of, yeah, it's okay. It was part of Eastern German history, and now they are just part of us, of the society at large. And so I don't think there's a cultural, if you want to look at Germany as a culture, as a people, which has problems in itself, but there has never been really a lesson that you can teach to school children. There's no intellectual depth to the analysis of what Nazi Germany meant, where it came from, and why it did what it did.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems of, in viewing and evaluating US history. There was kind of a mindless just we're good that is prevalent and still prevalent among conservatives. But what you really need is you need to judge, but you need to judge in terms of ideas, and what ideas led to good results and what ideas led to bad results, and what are we going to embrace and stand by, and what do we have to move away from, and what are the negative elements to cut out. And that unfortunately is happening in reverse, is that you smear the good elements and you whitewash the bad ones, and then I think it helps explain why we're moving in a bad direction.
And it's by the way, it's very unnecessary, because you don't have to identify with people from the past. Like the people living in Mongolia today are not the people who committed the atrocities across Asia, a couple of 100 years ago. You don't need to identify with certain people. You don't need to view them as perfectly good or perfectly bad. It's not like, oh, Don Watkins is an American. They were American slaveholders, so Don Watkins is somehow smeared by that. It's not true.
Yeah, I mean, and from my perspective, it's not just looking back at American history, but it's, if I was a German growing up in Germany, like the founding fathers would be enormous heroes of mine, right? Because they're human beings who stood for something really good. And so, I the first time I remember hearing your name was actually, it was just after Alex had finished the first moral case for fossil fuels, and we were in his office / bedroom at the time. And he said, do you know who was like most instrumental or, helpful in this book? And I kind of went through a list, and he looked and shook his head at who I named, who I won't mention. But then he said, no, it was this guy, Steffen. And I don't know if I had heard of you at that point, but I definitely took notice, and he was explaining kind of what you brought to the table. So tell me a little bit about how you got connected with Alex, and then how that collaboration started.
Well, as an unskilled hand, I was on the internet.
Every good story starts that way.
Yeah, every good story starts with internet now. So particularly on Facebook, and I was interested at the time. It was 2011, and I was interested since before Fukushima. I was interested in nuclear energy because it was just the coolest thing, opposed by the mainstream, particularly in Germany. And just look at the physics; it's so good. I remember, I think it was a university class. Someone someone let me calculate how many wagon loads full of coal one like big chunk of uranium replaces in terms of pure energy content. And so this was just the coolest thing for me. And I tried to learn everything about from nuclear reactor types to nuclear bomb types, everything about nuclear technology. That was the coolest thing. And then I went on Facebook and connected with all these people, and Alex was one of the upcoming people in this energy realm, and he had a lot of interesting ideas. And so you can just leave your comment there, be smart for 5 seconds. And so that's what I did. And then he noticed some of my I don't know if it was specifically a nuclear thing or an oil thing, but some comment he noticed, and he told me, "Hey, aren't you interested in writing something for me? Aren't you just interested in spreading this to a larger audience?" So this is how it began. And so my first work, I think, was was a DDT article, actually.
Yeah, that's it. Just as an aside on that point, I mean, this is one thing I actually learned watching Alex, was the value of, like, you could call it talent spotting, like keeping your eyes open for people who said things that were surprisingly interesting or good, and then like really taking that seriously and trying to help them gain a bigger audience, seeing how you can work with them, like not just doing what I think is very easy to do, which is go, oh, that was insightful, and then you move on with your life, but really getting excited about and having your eyes kind of on alert for interesting minds, particularly ones that you haven't heard of, like in unexpected places. And I mean, a lot of what I'm doing right now and trying to help people become better communicators of ideas is on the premise that there's a lot of talent out there that's not being utilized as much as it could be and as effectively as it could be. So then you guys start, talking, interacting. You write the DDT article, which that's still on our website. It has to be, right?
That's still on the website. Probably more than 50% of the links don't work anymore. But so this was a disaster, actually. I didn't realize at the time. So I was mightily struggling with writing myself. I was a good fact gatherer, but I wasn't really good at combining facts into something understandable by an outside audience. So that's a lot of back and forth and support by Alex. So he probably worked as much on it as I, time-wise, or nearly.
Well, but I mean, just that is not unusual in any case. The first op-ed I ever wrote for the Ayn Rand Institute was on smoking bans. And it must have taken, he was my editor on it, and it must have taken 6 months. And by the end, I think 3 sentences were mine, and the rest at one time or another had been, interjected by him. And he was never allowed to edit me again at ARI. But it was, it was that kind of, you're dealing with somebody who's like really great at communication and helps you realize how much you have to learn in order to be a really good communicator. And I mean,
they were the best sentences, probably, right?
It'd be interesting to try to unravel that mystery. So then say a little bit more, because I don't think people realize, or let me set this up a little bit. So Alex by that time had been studying energy on his own for years and had been kind of developing his thinking. And we got I guess around 2010 is when the contract came in for Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and gave him 6 months to write a book. And, and, he had been leveraging, people who were experts in different fields and whatnot. But the thing that you really brought to the table was the ability to understand and kind of assess a lot of these complicated things, like what is the actual state of the science on climate, and what are the state of climate models, and how exactly, certain kinds of energy worked, and bringing to it a real kind of ruthless focus on all right, what can we say that's actually true and precise? Whereas which is it's a huge benefit to somebody who's really good at thinking big picture about ideas and communicating them, to have somebody who can give you kind of reliable information and help you make sense of a really complicated sphere. So by the time you got to Alex, how long had you been like looking into energy and climate related issues?
I don't remember exactly, but it must have been years of interest at least. It's not. I didn't systematically research things. I just wanted to find out specifics, like how does this work? How does this nuclear reactor in Japan work? Like what can happen? What happens at the time? What is and so yeah, it must be probably 5-6 years of interest in topics like this. I didn't really get a good sense of context and proportion of the importance of something like fossil fuels as a category before I started at CIP. That was just learning on the fly. I just was interested in the technological aspects and certain facts, but I didn't put anything into a real context or evaluate it by a human standard. I was just interested in facts, and then CIP work forced me to rethink, like, what's the purpose here? What is the full truth in the full context of things, with the goal of, okay, what's important for humans? It's not like so. Before that, I would be just a standard technologically interested enthusiast for nuclear, and would say that, oh, let's just build as many nuclear plants as possible, no matter what, because that's the coolest technology. It's just the best.
I think like a lot of really good, intelligent people, the kind of ideas, well, if I know just all the fact, like if I really had that in my brain, then the right choices kind of are obvious at that point. Like there's not a kind of disciplined way of judging and assessing things as good or bad that I need to follow. It's sort of like, I just need to know, okay, what are the, the actual, facts of the case. I was going to ask something about, but when you're learning this on your own, I mean, how did you go about that in terms of, like, you have higher standards than anybody I know for, like, is this really true? And how did you develop that on your own? What did you have explicit principles in your mind of, like, yeah, this I regard as solid, this I regard as tentative, these I think the guys are full of it? Like, how did you end up formulating your standards?
So one thing is, I was curious. So I was curious about what is the actual truth. I learned pretty early on that, whatever you read or watch in the media is usually superficially accurate at best, but it doesn't remotely go into the depth that's necessary to understand the issue. And so then you seek out things, and it's the internet age, so you Google things, and you pretty quickly, when you ask specific questions, you pretty quickly learn from people who are like at least one layer deeper than that really can explain how do things work. And then I learned, okay, I need to be super honest with myself to understand that I don't just believe in things or just accept things, but I understand why they are true. So it's in sort of epistemological transformation from just being right on the surface to understanding why you're right and why other people are wrong. And that kind of, and so by my nature, I mean, I'm not a world-class physicist or chemist or whatever, so I need to take shortcuts, and I need to find out pretty quickly, like, who is a good explainer, who is an honest explainer, and who is just trying to score points. And so you develop some kind of skill to understand, okay, this is really useful information that you can learn from and that makes you understand things. And or this is just sort of a narrative that's put forward to win an argument. And I knew that from my history, like what this looks like. What is a narrative that just looks good to the low information consumer of this information. And so this is a skill you develop over time. It's not like the next day you just decide that this is a better thought than the other. You have to put some time into the details of everything, but you need to know how to take what shortcuts are appropriate to take to consume all the available information in the full context.
Yeah. And I mean, I think part of what's interesting about so part of being really concerned with the truth is it's not just seeing that, okay, what the New York Times says about climate is, let's call it, not obviously true. But on the other hand, I think what happens is particularly people who are more pro-freedom as we are, they take kind of over like super shortcuts, right? It's, here's people critical of climate catastrophism, and then I kind of blindly will just repeat what they say. Or an even more extreme bad version of that is, oh, I think I have like one simple fact that solves the scientific debate, right? It's sunspots or something. Yeah. And there's that kind of like intellectual shortcut, which can be very tempting to take, unless, like you said, your goal is not to prove something. Your goal is to get at what's true. And if you really take that seriously, and then you have the intellectual honesty to say, all right, what do I know? What don't I know? And then to, like you say, look for shortcuts, but to be aware that's what you're doing. And so you file that away as, I'm basing this on, an analysis from these scientists who I think are credible for these reasons, but I didn't I didn't go through the data that they went through to,
And you never measure the raw data. That's what you always have to be aware of at a minimum. So you have to understand, like, there's some sausage being made before you come into the factory.
What guidance do you have? And this doesn't have to be historical in terms of where you were, like in in 2010, 2011. But what are kind of guidelines you have for assessing people and thinkers, or let's call it intellectual organizations as well? Yeah, I think these people are generally credible versus things that send up red flags for you.
That's difficult. So one is experience. Like when you start looking for people who are trustworthy, you pretty quickly consume a lot of their material, and then you can see, okay, this is something where I have some knowledge, and this is not precisely what I would regard as the full context truth. Yeah. So you have to make some mistakes early on. This, like, you sometimes tend to trust certain people that appear very honest, and then you learn some facts or context that invalidates that. So sometimes you make mistakes. You have to be aware that, yeah, as you said, I'm basing this on someone else's knowledge or insight, and then you have to remember, this is not your stuff. You didn't create this piece of knowledge. And then you also have to identify, like, what's the important truth in there. So if you're talking about complex issues like an energy policy or climate policy or something, you have to understand that it's not a single fact that decides whether something is right or wrong. Like, you could get a single number right or wrong, like the Earth's temperature. Could get that wrong by plus minus 1 degree. Doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really matter in the full context of what should we do about fossil fuels. There's a host of issues that you need to evaluate, and so the way I do it, I trust no one, even if I have a long history of using their material, believing practically the same thing that they say all the time. Even then, I double and triple check things when they are important. Like, the shortcut is, okay, there's a trivial thing, there's a throwaway fact that this person mentions, I can take that. It doesn't, even if I get burned and I get invalidated on that, it doesn't burn me. But if this importantly changes a specific trend that's super important for my argument, I have to double and triple check. So it's not a matter of belief or trust for me. This is obviously not how everyone who is busy doing other things can do it, but that's what I sort of get paid for. I have to double and triple check other people where it's important. And then, there are things that you sometimes take for granted, but you have to be careful that these are not things that are crucial and central to your argument to yourself. First of all, you must be sure that you're on the right side, that you're correct. And so part of this is not, is every little minute detail in this thing correct? Do I get this, like the 10th digit behind the decimal point right? But do I get the trend right? Is this plausible? Is this believable by me if I just have a hostile attitude towards this person? And if you do this in a rigorous, and some people might call this a pedantic way, then you can evaluate things, even if you're not on the same level of knowledge and training as a person who created the original piece of data or piece of knowledge or white paper or whatever. But it's like I never trust people, especially if I do like what they say. I don't just trust that. I just always make a plausibility check and try to find a hostile take on it. But you have a time budget, and then you have to find out like what's the important big figure, big trend that I need to evaluate.
Well, part of what I think makes this more here's something I never liked about most intellectual writing, and I don't think I did it much, and then by the time I became fully aware of it, don't do it at all, which is there's a style of intellectual writing that is like, let me pull out the latest studies, minimum wage, look at it, here's 10 studies that say it increased unemployment. And then if you asked people, well, yeah, is that really why you believe that the minimum wage is wrong? And what about those 10 other studies? Well, yeah, I can pick those apart. But if I was that careful with the studies I just cited, I could pick those apart too. There's just this kind of throwing out some studies that don't actually reflect why you believe what you believe. And yet that's supposed to convince other people. And part of what I realized is, set aside that there's something really bad in terms of your own motivation for doing that. That doesn't convince anybody, like, because they hear 10 different studies and they either throw up their arms and go, who knows, what to do. Or they're just going to pick the ones that support what they're already inclined to believe. And one of the things that I think we're really careful with at CIP is that, there's certain areas where we just think like you can't, like, so take how many deaths are caused by air pollution. So not CO2, but actual air pollutants. And you get these, all kinds of different studies. And our view is not they get the number wrong, but that this is not, let's at least put it, easily knowable. And nobody has really given a plausible, careful account that there's tons of assumptions being made, and you could reach completely, different conclusions by other assumptions. So like, we don't engage in the throw around convenient study game. And so I forget where I was going with that. What I was going to say is that what we try to focus on is, as you're suggesting, not how can we just kind of overwhelm people with studies that seem to support our view, but what are the most important questions to be asking here? And then what are the most reliable facts to help us answer those questions? And I think that kind of discipline is really valuable. And you realize that, okay, in most cases, one of the things you find, one part of the argument for the moral case for fossil fuels is that even if some of these more extreme claims about the impact of CO2 or the impact of air pollution were true, they're still not coming anywhere close to the overwhelming benefits from fossil fuels. And so if you think about the question in the right way, what counts as evidence, that changes enormously. Whereas if you think that the benefits of fossil fuels are kind of like, oh, well, we'll save a few dollars, a year on electricity, well, then it doesn't take a lot of negatives to wipe that out.
Yeah, I think if we can take one positive thing from 2020 is that more people learn that the data is a complex issue and you better know what you're talking about. So if you are calculating case fatality rates and overall fatality rates and so on, you better precisely know how the data is defined and who counts as a COVID death and things like that. And you can manipulate a lot of opinion with different data definitions, and all of these, like most of the thought leaders don't actually know anything about the evidence they cite. They will say, oh yeah, there's this professor from here and there who tells us that everything can be solar, wind, and a little hydro. Or someone else will say one study claims, or you mentioned air pollution numbers like the millions here or millions there, and what exactly is the definition of that, and how do they know, how do they estimate this? And so nobody knows this, but it's just a convenient talking point that is not actually understood. And so what I try to do is to understand the talking point to a level of depth where I can explain what are the numbers, where do they come from, how do I know they are correct, or at least in the ballpark of right, so that I get the trend correct. So
yeah,
so
one takeaway I've had in part from working with you is just I'm much more careful about, like, take the COVID debate. I wrote one thing on it that basically went out of its way not to take a position on any of the scientific issues, but said, all right, what can we know about how to act, just just from kind of, if you want to put it, first principles. But one downside of that, if you want to call it a downside, is that there's a lot of people who are not careful, not interested in the truth, who rush in. And so it's, I think it's important and right that better people be very concerned with the truth, but it does then, it just, given time and knowledge, constrains a lot of what you can say, which is probably for the better. I'm in enough controversial debates as it is. But what are your thoughts on that sort of phenomenon, that, because it is so time consuming and difficult to reach the truth, that this makes it a lot easier for people who are not even, I was going to say, not even pretending to be concerned with the truth, but there's that type, but they're, so it's so not big on their radar screen that what the public gets and ends up citing is, often garbage.
Yeah. So there's a footnote problem, right? So in a sense, you could say there's a grand strategy in producing overwhelming numbers of science in terms of paperwork. You just publish paper after paper after paper saying the same thing or saying some similar thing, and there's no way that even an expert in the field can consume all of that literature material and check it. You just can't do that. So if there's a trend and sort of a corruption in a field that the same things gets repeated over and over again, there's no way that anyone can evaluate, was there ever any empirical science involved in the first original paper of this? There's no way to do that. So I'm allergic to people who use too many footnotes without any explanation. If you're just a litany of talking points with only like abstract footnotes where you have to go into the library to find a paper and study their methodology, you don't want to explain things to me. You just want to overwhelm me with the science, or if you say the science, right? So one example was this hopefully now infamous Barack Obama tweet from President Obama. The science says like climate change is real and dangerous and so on. And then he cited this, I think it was a 2013 paper, just a survey of what the literature said about human influence on the climate. So it wasn't even about dangerous or not dangerous. So it's just like this is the end result of like people just want to jump on a talking point and just want it to be true no matter what, and then use it for their own goals. And so this is kind of a huge problem. And a worse problem is that everyone in this food chain of academia has an incentive to play along. So this is really so in the next version of the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, we'll see some examples of that. But there's really, it's not like this is a conspiracy. This is not people meeting in a smoky room and exchanging envelopes or something like that. This is not like people need to meet. Everyone knows what you need to do to publish a paper in Science X, what you need to get a grant, what you need to be cited a lot. And this kind of incentive, this career incentive in these fields can produce a lot of literature that is then called science, even if there's no scientific method ever applied in any of these papers. And then you get a lot of the corruption and a lot of the footnotes that are unfortunately useful to these thought leaders that don't want to explain. They just want a footnote that fits somehow for their talking point.
Yeah, I mean, the way it stands in my mind is when I see a footnote, it's, I heard this from Bill. Like, it's that kind of thing. Like, maybe Bill's brilliant, and if you read him, it would be, but that's not evidence. Like, I have no more confidence in this because there's a little number and because Bill said it than if you just, assert it. It's okay. What's the evidence? And I mean, that's one of the things that's, to go to the positive that we try to do is not just be very careful in what sources we regard as legitimate, but then provide the evidence that allows the reader to judge for himself, and then he can check where did this number come from and whatnot. But that what you're trying to do is basically make it as easy as possible for somebody who's really trying to get at the truth to get at it. That's the kind of the goal of how we're going to present ideas.
And one of the most fascinating things is working with at CIP is the emails we get. Like, our audience, our people who are friendly to our cause, they will double and triple check. They will find the error. They will find the rounding error. And I really like that. It's not like I need some incentive to be really super honest with my numbers, but it's, there are people out there that are just interested in, is this really true? Can I replicate the thought process and the data mingling and find the same things? And we have not a huge amount of people, but some people who are skilled with Excel and rigorous in finding out what's true, what's not true. And they will find every dead link, and they will find every calculation mistake. And then you can really have good feedback. Hey, was my thinking right? Did I get something wrong, but it didn't change the trend? Something like that. So a lot of the big mistakes that I know of that I made, I found myself, and I corrected them retroactively, of course. But I can be sure if I make a big mistake that there are people out there that are sympathetic to my cause, but they will check me honestly.
Well, that's one of the things that I deal with people who want to write or engage in the realm of ideas in one form or another. And a lot of people don't, because they feel like, all right, I'm not ready, or I want to basically no, I want to get rid of all my mistakes before I actually risk going out into the arena. And part of my view is you want to be sharing your work publicly as early as possible, in part precisely because you get that kind of feedback. And that's really, really helpful. I mean, one of the mistakes that I made with my books is that they were all kind of like, I got a lot of feedback from editors and things along the way, but not public feedback, not sharing it with the world and getting like, is this even interesting to you? Right. So it's, you put a year or two into a book and then put it out into the world and like, well, I hope this, I hope this goes well. Whereas you want that kind of feedback on the arguments, on the facts, that double checking that on is your case really compelling? Are people even interested in what you have to say? And yeah, I think that's it's a huge benefit when you have an audience who's in effect helping you do your work better. And but you need to see it that way, right? Like you need to have the attitude of like, I don't want to be wrong, so if I am, please let me know so I can, go back and correct it. And then you feel bad for a day or two, and then that fades, and now you've learned this lesson. Any other I'm curious as to any other things you've mentioned, kind of the broader methodology you've learned from Alex, and then the benefits of feedback from our audience. Any other things you've learned that jump out that have been really useful or surprising about working at CIP and working with Alex, particularly anything that you think might be surprising to our audience?
Well, one is just the thinking method, the framework, as Alex calls it, of finding out what's right and what's wrong, and how to think about things. That changed a lot in my mind over the 9 years. That's probably the most important lesson that I took out of that. Well, I don't know at this point. Nothing comes to mind right now, but there's probably a lot that I learned that I don't realize I really learned. But I mean, there were many skills that I had to learn actually to do my job well. So that's just
well, it's so funny. It's so funny you put it that way, like things you don't realize you learn. One of our colleagues, she used to be, she went off for a while to do a different job, and wrote to me that it was shocking to be reminded that most of the world does not work the way that we work at CIP, like with the intensity and the kind of like, it's a small team that's doing a lot. You can only do a lot if you're really aggressive. But after you've done it for years, you forget, oh yeah, people don't like most places, even places where you work hard are often are pretty laid back. But you don't experience it that way until you work with somebody who's really structured things so that, all right, we really want to get the most out of each of us so that we can, because we have big ambitions.
One thing that Alex is really pushing me and probably you for is just make the thing self-contained and readable to an audience with no experience. This is a perspective that I totally didn't have. I just knew all these things, and if you don't know these things, that's your problem. Mm-hmm. That was sort of my implicit attitude, and so this is having this goal of producing something valuable to an outside audience. I think that's a really great skill in general to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the way I think about it is this, which is that, you, in order to do something that's genuinely valuable to others, it needs to be true. It needs to be, it has a number of requirements, but at least it needs to be true and then presented clearly and persuasively to them. And what often happens is that people who are good at one side of that equation or the other often tend to be different people, right? Like the people who are great communicators are not often the most rigorous thinkers. And thankfully, I think we've had the benefit of a team who I think are all both rigorous thinkers interested in the truth and really able to communicate those ideas. But I think bringing together people who are specialized in one of those areas so that, you have a real specialization in getting at the truth in these complicated cases. And then, I've more on the communication side, and then Alex's ability to synthesize all of that in the way that he does. That there's a good division of labor there that I think. One thing I encourage other intellectuals and intellectual organizations to think about is how to leverage those kinds of minds and talents. So the way that it usually works in the intellectual world, And maybe not in academia. I'm not as familiar there. Maybe they do this more with the way that they basically use graduate students as slaves. But like in the think tank world, I think there's a lot of like, you'll have somebody who's really, really good, and then the idea is, all right, they're going to mentor other people, many of whom are not that great, and hopefully make them kind of better versions of themselves, but just let's call them B players. And there's just such a it's useful to consider the idea of, like, you take the best person and help them leverage the talents of other really talented people, but who aren't going to be like, the famous thought leaders, and you just make that person way more effective. And I think particularly for a small movement like an objectivism, I'd rather have like the 10 best people be working with 100 really outstanding people to make them even better than trying to have like, 1,000 like mediocre, or 100, I forget the numbers I use, but like 100 like mediocre people who are trying to do everything by themselves. I just think that model doesn't work very well, because it's the people who gain influence are the top minds with the whole package. I mean, basically is what I think you see in the culture.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, Steffen. Thanks for coming on. It's been fun talking to you. It's been fun working with you. And how can people follow our work, I guess?
Oh, work. Yeah. So thanks for the invitation. I think you can just go to industrialprogress.com and hop on the newsletter, and then you'll see practically everything I'm involved in. So if you're interested in energy, in particular, energytalkingpoints.com has a lot of synthesized material. So there's really no way to really get my stuff, because my stuff is just sort of ingrained in everything that CIP does.
Yeah, although I want to recommend to people, and if I forget to link to it, hopefully one of my audience members will remind me. You did a video on the kind of economics of wind and solar a while back. It was just such a great example of being able to explain a really complicated idea, but that's really important, in a really clear, accessible way. Do you remember the title to that?
Yeah. How bad are solar and wind? If you just
so,
Google my name and that, you should find it.
Yeah, and that's truly excellent. And for those of you who are less familiar with Steffen's work, that'll give you a real sense of how he thinks about things and approaches things, and on a crucially important topic. All right. Thanks again, Steffen.
Thank you.